This is our 7th Global Challenges Conference, and this year's focus is on global local inequalities. Tonight's keynote speaker is really the perfect person to frame the discussion and analysis of what we need to do for social change at the community level to increase access to resources and opportunities. Tonight's keynote speaker is Diana Wells, the president of Ashoka, a global organization dedicated to supporting and advancing social entrepreneurship around the world. When Dr. Wells first worked at Ashoka after graduating from Brown in 1988, she created one of the organization's core programs, a network through which social entrepreneurs around the world can share ideas and learn from one another. When she returned to Ashoka, having earned a PhD in anthropology at NYU, she led the organization's geographic expansion as a global social movement and developed a widely used and highly respected tool to measure the impact of social entrepreneurship. Dr. Wells has too many accomplishments to mention them all, so I will just name a few. She was a Fulbright Scholar, a Woodrow Wilson Scholar. She is a trustee of Brown University. She's on the advisory board of the Center for the Advancement of Social Entrepreneurship at Duke's Business School. She's the author and editor of many journal articles and books. She's the recipient of the George Mason University's inaugural Social Innovation Champion in 2011. And last but not least, she is nearly part of the Mount Holyoke family because her sister graduated from Mount Holyoke College. So we are deeply honored to welcome Diana Wells as the keynote speaker for tonight and for the Global Challenges Conference.
It's great to be here. I haven't been here since the late 70s when I would visit my sister. And in fact, Mount Holyoke has a special place in my heart because it was the first college dorm I ever stayed at overnight. And having had a sister at Smith who never invited me to do so, Holyoke is way cool. So on a more serious note, this conference's theme on global and local inequalities goes to the heart of what inspired Bill Drayton to start Ashoka years ago. 38 years ago, I believe, and to pioneer the social entrepreneurship movement and the Everyone a Changemaker movement that we are now articulating. It goes to the core of inequality in that the idea that drove the creation of Ashoka is that the people who had ideas to transform the reality in which they were living needed some support, not gigantic World Bank huge contracts, but a little bits of support, small financing so that they could quit their job and work full-time on their idea. And Bill Drayton and then a small group of others joined him to begin to find these people who had ideas to transform systems and change the world for the better. This weekend's discussion is more critical now than ever before because we live in an unprecedented time when inequalities on so many fronts seem more visible and divisive than ever. But my time at Ashoka has offered me another view and another piece of what's happening that's moving toward a new and different kind of equality. One that's defined by the percentage of any community, school, group that finds change makers within it. We live in an era that requires change-making talent. It's the age where value is no longer defined by efficiency and repetition. And I'm going to say that again, where value is no longer defined by the efficiency of repetition. Let's put an end to that era. It is over. We already see it over. We can predict that artificial intelligence will and is taking over many repetitive functions, which have employed many people. So what human ingenuity can replace that? The rate of change in the world and the number of people causing change has been accelerating exponentially for at least the last 300 years. Technology and machines changed living standards and made the world more competitive. The rate of growth has been steadily increasing from 20% in the 18th century to 740% in the last century, 1900 to 2000. We see technology increasing even faster, where a child's PlayStation, according to a professor at MIT, is more powerful than military computers in 1996. McKinsey states that 8 to 9% of the labor population in 2030 will be jobs in new types of occupations that haven't existed before. The relevancy of these facts is, well, many of our parents grew up in being trained for jobs that 1 or 2 or 3 jobs over the course of their career. Many of you will be graduating into jobs that don't yet exist or didn't exist 5, 10 years ago. Over the last 2 centuries, the defining skills that helped advance equality were based on our education system and a public education system where teaching, reading, writing, math served the growth of industry that we were building as a society, the Industrial Revolution. But in this century, the requirements are different. In a constantly changing environment, we need the skills to be able to adapt to change. Our challenge for this century is to marshal our human ingenuity for change for the better, for the good of all, or what Ashoka has called an everyone a changemaker world. I started my unpaid internship at Ashoka in the late 1980s. When no one had heard of social entrepreneurship, we were barely using the term ourselves. Now, 30 years later, Ashoka has offices in 38 countries, supporting 3,600 social entrepreneurs around the world, partnering with 50 universities as changemaker campuses globally, working with students, university stakeholders to encourage change making. We also work with companies, business entrepreneurs, primary and secondary schools to ensure that what we've learned about making change will enable everyone to be a change maker. I've been fortunate to be part of Ashoka for much of this evolution, except for the time that I stepped out to do my PhD. It's been a privilege to see the world through a lens of solutions. In this talk, I'm going to share a few things about what I've learned from working with social entrepreneurs, some thoughts about starting a changemaker journey, and then move to Q&A. So what have I learned from social entrepreneurs about change making? I think of social entrepreneurs as the Olympians of change making, for those of you who are watching the Olympics. To quote Bill Drayton, social entrepreneurs don't give a person a fish, don't teach a person to fish, but don't rest until they've changed the fishing industry. The measuring effectiveness, the work that I was doing to chart how we would measure system change, we've been looking at this data over nearly 2 decades now, and there's a very clear pattern, and where after 5 years, more than half of our social entrepreneurs are changing policy at the national level. 90% are still pursuing the idea that they set out to solve. Doesn't mean that they're still in the organization, and that number drops to 85 10 years out, but that there's a persistence and a persistent focus to address the changes that they're looking to work on. And when you compare that to the stats on small businesses, where 9 out of 10 fail within the first 3 years, it's a radically different number. We're looking for people who have the stick-to-itiveness and the persistence to change the systems that they're looking to change. There's so many things about my work that social entrepreneurs have taught me, and I thought I'd share a couple of ideas. First one being, social entrepreneurs see assets where others see liabilities. Let me give you a few examples, and I'm going to start with rats. As a child, our Ashoka fellow Bart Wegens had a pet rat. Years later, when he was looking at the problem of landmines in Africa in the mid-1990s, he recognized that he needed a cheap, efficient technology that relied on locally available resources to do so. In an old rented laboratory in Belgium, Bart started to train rats to detect explosives in minute amounts. Bart worked with the Tanzania People's Defense Forces to build the training program and found a particular kind of rat, the African giant poached rat, which is endemic to sub-Saharan Africa and also has a longer lifespan. Compared to human manual demining, a rat can scan an average of 100 meters in half an hour, which is twice the area covered by an expert human in one day. Another example from an Ashoka fellow who is also flipping the presumption of deficiency into one of asset is Torkel Sonnen, our first social entrepreneur from Scandinavia who we brought into our network. He's the father of an autistic child, and he set out to solve his biggest worry. How would his child live independently when he was gone? As a parent, he recognized his child's own special ability, and building on that asset, he created an organization called Specialitisme, with the goal of creating 1 million jobs for autistic individuals whose abilities offer employees a unique asset. His work was so in demand in the United States that he moved here and has been training HR, human resource departments in Fortune 500 companies across the US and Europe, creating jobs for young people with autism, where he's training for onboarding and working with a special needs population that then becomes a core asset of these companies. And a last example from India. Unlike many around her, Jaru Bilmoria didn't complain or ignore the rising number of street children that greeted her on her way home from work every day. And she decided to do something about it. She created a phone helpline for street children. She started by bringing social services that were working with children across Mumbai together. And one thing that happened in that process was these organizations didn't even know each other existed, and now did, and could figure out which ones could serve which neighborhoods and which pieces better. Within 3 years, she had set this up in 30 cities across India. And the real breakthrough was that she brought in some of the children themselves to answer the phone line, so that when someone called, they were speaking to a peer who knew how to speak to them and could direct them to the services that they needed. The other piece of this that was so transformative was she got a company to build a pro bono a big data capturing database on a pro bono basis that ended up becoming something she didn't fully imagine initially, which was, it was simply to log and track these calls, but more quickly, this became a data resource that drove public policy, because she could track migration data, where these people were, the children were migrating from, epidemiological data, where the corrupt police departments in the city were that would beat these kids up. And so one of the unintended consequences was an enormous resource of data that could drive public policy, allowing people to see patterns that previously were invisible. Finding assets where others see liabilities. Second piece that I learned from social entrepreneurs is how they think about scale. One question I get a lot is, how come social entrepreneurs don't hit big scale? What are the stories of scale? Where are the Googles and the Facebooks in the social entrepreneurship space? I think they are. We just don't see them. And an example I like to use to illustrate this point is Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale is credited with having the idea of, or the first person to practice medical triage that we know of. Medical triage is the underlying system that any of us all around the world who have entered an ER or an urgent care facility, is the idea that drives that system. But when we walk into these clinics, there's no plaque to Florence Nightingale, there's no branding, there's no recognition. So all of the end users may not know. It's a great example of a social entrepreneur whose ideas spread, and spread because it's so obvious. But there are plenty of social entrepreneurs that are spreading their ideas because that is what's driving them. Working for the good of all, not driven by shareholders or brand ownership. Instead, ensuring that the idea is spread as far as possible, as quickly as possible, getting the solutions into the hands who most need it. Another example is a woman from Bangladesh named Surya Haq, who started an organization named Fulki, and another learning on scale. Surya was working in a garment factory in Bangladesh, and she found that as she was hiring people to work in the factory, she was turning women away who had a young child, or she was worried they were going to have a young child and then leave. And that bothered her. So instead of not hiring young women, she decided to do something about it. And her solution was to bring child care into the factories so that women could breastfeed during breaks, could be with their children during lunch. And what she found was these women were healthier, they missed fewer days, they stayed longer, and the children thrived. It became so popular that other factories invited her in to do the same. And then it jumped industries, so it was no longer just the garment factories. Her organization for a while that was doing this got bigger and bigger. But after a while, her organization was no longer necessary because as it spread across industries, others started innovating into the space. If this was a business, it would have been a failure. But for someone working for the social good, not having to drive that change themselves is the ultimate success. So how social entrepreneurs work offers us great examples needed for this century of increasing change. Each one of these stories that I mentioned were inspired by empathy, and not a passive empathy, but an active cognitive empathy, where the brain kicks in and action follows. These social entrepreneurs created roles for others. This is another core insight. Creating roles for others to be change makers, to come in and participate in doing this work. And we found at Ashoka that we have at least 3 children of, and it's all women, actually, all mothers of social entrepreneurs. So we have 3 women child social entrepreneurs in our network. And we have a number of others who worked for someone who was an elected Ashoka Fellow and the next generation, someone who was an employee, came up with an idea that we then are invited into our network. So for the rest of us mere mortals who are non-Olympians or social entrepreneurs, how do we start our change-making journey? I'm sure many of you already have, but I'm going to tell you my little story. The first change-making act that I remember was when I was 8 years old, and my 3rd grade teacher brought us to the state capitol, Hartford, Connecticut, where we lobbied to have the sperm whale become the state animal. Not that lobbying, well, not a huge issue, but I have to tell you the effect when I heard that the whale was named the state animal was the first experience where I had been part of something bigger than myself. And it sounds completely absurd, but it mattered. And I remembered this story 20 years later, having forgotten it, when we are working with our social entrepreneurs, bringing them into our network. One of the things we do is a life history, understanding where the idea came from, how it emerged from an individual's life and life experience. And what we find is that so many of the people who grew up to be social entrepreneurs started when they were young, started when they were teens. And they credit a mentor, someone in their life who helped them give themselves permission to do this work. Whether it was a neighbor, a family member, a religious leader, someone from their religious community who helped them through the hurdles of failure or the pick them up after a rough patch. And while I would say that exercising your change-making muscle makes it stronger over time, it's never too late to start. Ashoka Fellow Mark Friedman started Civic Ventures just for this purpose, which was to give people at the end of their careers another chance to do something for the social good. Advice number 2, understand your context and your place in that context. During my junior year in college, I studied for a year in Varanasi. As an 18-year-old, having grown up in a small town in Connecticut, my world was turned on its head, and it was a perfect timing because at 18, it shook up so many things that I had taken for granted. But it also, having been through that experience, helped me recognize what the possibilities of what could be rather than what I always assumed had been. While there, I got involved in a local organization that was cleaning up the Ganges River, a holy river for Hindus and the source of both ritual activity as well as the main water source through the city, lots of activity. And while the college student that I was at the time, my solution would have been to start discussing germ theory with a local organization, but thankfully I was not in charge. because I'm not sure that would have worked. But for the locally run organization, there was a completely different strategy, which was based on reinterpreting Hindu myths and inviting citizen action as a way to reclaim the river. And that experience helped me recognize that my own, my being an outsider had limitations. But I also had the reverse experience while there, where being an outsider had a complete advantage. And that was another independent study that I did, included doing life histories of widows who had come to Varanasi and who had been kicked out of their homes or living on the street, and there was a government home set up for them. One day after finishing a history of one woman, she turned to her friend and said, "Okay, it's your turn." And I understood, well, I had studied Hindi and Urdu. The women that I was speaking to that day were refugees from Bangladesh, and one of them said to me in Bengali, she turned to her friend and said, "It's your turn to tell the story." And her friend turned to me and said, "Well, why should I tell her? Why should I tell you my story?" And her friend turned to her and said, "If you don't, nobody from the outside will ever know, and our situation will never change." And I took a deep breath at it. For an 18-year-old from a very different place, suddenly I had a role to play, and I needed to play it. Advice number 3. So, understand your context and your place in that context. Advice number 3, diversity matters. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because that's when the learning happens. The best kind of teams are teams with diverse skill sets, diverse perspectives, enabling you to see and challenge ideas from multiple perspectives, because that's what will help them succeed. So we need to get out of our comfort zones in the classroom, in outside work, and in the world. My own PhD dissertation work helped me see this and understand it at a different level, where in Trinidad and Tobago, where I did my research, in a society with no majority, equally, and with where political parties were largely divided along ethnic lines, I found that women's power was defined by their access to information, and that because women were connecting across divisions in a way that men weren't. So that knowledge of how an other operated was allowed women access in a different kind of way, and that information was included access. 20 years later, just a couple months ago, Trinidad and Tobago has just elected its first prime minister. As students here at Mount Holyoke, you have a unique role to play in the way the world is changing, away from a society defined by the value of repetition to a society defined by building something new and for the good of all. More resources are now available here at the university, being devoted to social entrepreneurship and social impact and innovation. And you have an institution that understands this change. According to Ashoka's university network, over 300 faculty are actively teaching and researching social entrepreneurship across the world. 30 university programs on social entrepreneurship exist with certificates or majors or master's degrees, and that's growing every week. This phenomenon is not limited to just one hemisphere or one continent. It's global, and it represents an historic change, fundamentally increasing our ability to address the world's most pressing problems. Here on campus, I'm sure you know, community-based learning course offerings exist on social entrepreneurship, internships here and abroad, seed funding for social innovation projects. It's a remarkable set of resources to set you on your way. If higher education's goal is to prepare students for the future, but next year's freshmen are going to be graduating into a world where the kinds of jobs they will have don't yet exist, how can a university prepare students for that world? My answer is social innovation is helping you get there. That the measure of success and the new baseline for equality will be the skills for change-making and social innovation. This opportunity before us is a step toward a new equality. Nick Kristof wrote from Davos, "The most interesting people in Davos aren't the presidents or celebrities, but the social entrepreneurs, those building business tools to address social problems. And their work offers an inspiring window into what can be accomplished." And of course, Margaret Mead. I'm an anthropologist after all. "Never doubt that a thoughtful group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." So as you go home tonight, think about the ways in which your world is not as you wish, and think about remaking it. Thank you.
Questions, comments? Be brief.
One thing I can say that I should have not missed is of the social entrepreneurs in our network, 40% of them are women, and that is something that has been consistent over time and over geography. And when I first did this deep dive research, looking at the 3,000 at the time, I thought 40, 60, that's not so good at all. But by dint of our criteria, that's individuals who have an idea for system change that we expect to have national impact, that the statistics of the social entrepreneurs we have, over half of them are having national impact only after 5 years, that these are individuals who have authored their ideas and are leading organizations or movements. And I can't think of another sector or industry that has that percentage of women in leadership roles. So social entrepreneurship has created a remarkable space. And of course, there are many, many in our network who are working specifically on gender equity. In fact, 10 of them are gathering at the end of this week to discuss some of the barriers. While we see this number of women who are social entrepreneurs in our network, we are seeing that women spreading their ideas and are scaling in different ways. And so this group of 10 social entrepreneurs are gathering with some of our staff for us to look at what some of the barriers are that are keeping women scaling at a different rate than men, and also exploring this idea of scaling deep rather than scaling broad.
Hello, my name is Annalisa Villars. I'm a social entrepreneur. I'm actually entering my 10th year, so I'm glad I survived the last 9. To your point, I think it's so important to be resilient. It's one thing that we don't discuss is how hard it is to actually create change in the world. If you think about it, inertia at rest, it requires a huge amount of external force to actually move things around, create the world. My question to you has to do with your point around scale and some of the things in the world we want to change. So the latest statistics from Oxfam recently shows that the richest 1% of the world backed 82% of the world's wealth last year. And my question to you is, as you survey the landscape of social entrepreneurship, what do you think are some of the moonshots? And where do you think some of these investments should be directed? So one of the answers I have for you about what the barriers are, what some of the barriers are for creating change in the world is capital. So as you think about what needs to happen in the world, this is a capital, we live in a capital system. Cash funds operations, cash funds growth. Without cash, it's impossible to scale. So the other question I have is related to this is how do you see technology play a role in the moonshots? As opposed to AI, for example, disrupting jobs and creating unemployment. How can, for example, AI be used to create unemployment? How do you tie some of these together?
I find, I'm always struck by conversations across with social entrepreneurs who say that money isn't the problem, talent is. And finding people who will have the stick-to-itiveness that the social entrepreneur has, which is the change-making muscle, and having the change-maker muscle while staying well and not burning out, which is another conversation. The Ashoka model has been to not move lots of capital, but very small amounts of capital to the right place. And the right place being investing small amounts in people's ideas and then building a supporting network so that they do persist. And it's another piece of our measuring effectiveness data with how many attribute their ability to persist with the support network that Ashoka has offered. Working with young people to ensure that there are more change makers out there and they have the skills to persist.
First of all, thank you so much for speaking to us. Your speech was very informative and very insightful. My question is that with all the change makers and global leaders that are rising from our generation and founding their own organizations and initiatives, could this possibly be a problem that there are so many different organizations with different interests, different missions, so that instead of collaborating with larger organizations, say like the World Bank, IMF, et cetera, UN, et cetera, there's instead a clash of interest within the countries in which they're not intervening, but helping to improve?
It's a great question. I have a bias. I have a clear point of view that there are a lot of problems out there, and right now the problems are outrunning the solutions. So I'm all about investing in this investing in a lot of solutions, and we see what will persist and work in the end. I think that larger organizations become their own bureaucracies at times, and it's hard to move and change something that has already gotten big. So I think a lot of smaller investing in ideas and the kinds of social entrepreneurs that I have had the privilege of working with, have these special qualities of empathy, of offering people roles, and aren't afraid of partnering, drawing people in, building social capital. And so we're already seeing some in the last decade especially, where people are joining forces. So I think it's easier to join forces of small groups than trying to I'm also someone who has always believed in working inside to change, and I've seen some efforts of the World Bank, for instance, that have been forces for change. But I don't think we have the ideas yet that are really going to work.
Hi. Thank you very much for your work, and thank you for your presentation. It's very inspiring. My question is, you started off by noting some characteristics of social entrepreneurs, and one of them was that they think differently about scale. And for those of us not in social entrepreneurship on a daily basis, can you give some remedial explanation
Yes,
of what you mean
sure.
about scaling,
Yep.
as you say, and some examples of how they think differently about it?
So absolutely. So in business, scale is usually seen as growth in terms of organization, in terms of budget, in terms of profit. So bigger is better and more. And so the examples I was offering were different. We want the idea to go big, but but for an idea to go big and spread doesn't necessitate more staff, more financing, more organization.
Hello, my name is Philippe, and I am a student from UMass. And we don't have a big social entrepreneurship thing going over there. But we do have this one social entrepreneurship class that I'm taking right now, and that had Ashoka as one of the resources that we should look at. So, and for me, being a business major, concentrating on entrepreneurship, it always has been about profit, return on interest, investment, all that jazz. And for me, I was always trying to be a social entrepreneur. I never found the words for it until I came upon that class. And so I think I'm kind of like just projecting my dilemma, and I think a lot of people are feeling it too. What advice do you give for someone who wants to be a social entrepreneur, who believes that they can make a change in the community, but is caught in between this, I have to go and work and make money, or I have to get this special skill set or special tenure experience, instead of just going out there and making that change, making those connections.
So I think, so yes, we all need to earn a living, and we do. But the mindset of being open to transforming things is the first piece, right? So most of the social entrepreneurs we know started on the side after working a full day, and after learning and understanding the problem, the approach, and trying. This is exactly why Ashoka started up, so that somebody could quit their job and have support, financial support, and time away to just focus on this idea. And 38 years ago, it was the only player in this space there, but there are many more now. Echoing Green is another for, and there are many more at we're even seeing at high school and universities, or opportunities for university students to apply for funding so that they can focus on ideas. In David Bornstein's book, How to Change the World, there's an appendix with some resources for opportunities for funding. But there are also plenty of jobs out there, because social entrepreneurs are running organizations for mentorship in working with people, and to where you can have a full-time job, but be learning how another social entrepreneur operates for you down the line to spin off. So those are a couple of ideas.
Thank you so much for your inspiration and really appreciate that. I'm curious about how do you integrate social innovation with organizational change and collaboration to advance public goods and public service? And I have another question. This is.
So I want to make sure I understood the question. How does social entrepreneurship connect with organizational transformation?
Yep.
So in looking at how social entrepreneurs run their organizations versus how other organizations without social entrepreneurs leading them or having been created, social entrepreneurs are operating a little bit differently. They tend not to build big bureaucracies. They tend to have light organizations and more movement building. And you know, some of the examples that I offered where they're not trying to do everything themselves and have ownership in a way that a business might, but are partnering with others, bringing others in. Does that answer your question?
Yep, that makes sense. Creating partnership is definitely important. And the other question is, how do you envisioning your social entrepreneurship trajectory, not only just where you start off, but also where you see landing at?
The work that Ashoka has done has been, for the model for Ashoka is that Ashoka would never predict the social entrepreneur and their team's vision. We're looking to build a network of these people who share common characteristics and share the aspiration for remaking the world for the better for all. And unlike, you know, the work that Ashoka does, we invest heavily into the upfront selection process so that we get to know individuals without presuming that we have the idea or vision that the individual and their team is building. So, and this goes to the heart of how Ashoka sought to position itself quite differently from other funding or foundations where we're really backing the person and their team rather than an organization. So we wouldn't presume to envision what that social entrepreneur and I like to use the metaphor of midwifing, that Ashoka helps midwife, our selection process helps midwife an idea, but it wouldn't presume to predict an idea. If your question was about Ashoka, envisioning how Ashoka will transform, Ashoka's already gone through, you know, having simply worked with social entrepreneurs, we're now have gone through a strategic shift where we recognize that having brought the idea of social entrepreneurship, we recognize that we have the ability to help other mind shifts and changing frameworks of thinking around social issues more generally. So we're working in the space right now of seeking to change the way young people grow up so that they don't lose the empathy that they're born with, and that their change-making skills are encouraged at an early age. And what will come next will be a series of ideas like that are drawn from our network of social entrepreneurs. So what will the innovation be that we can help drive at a global level for health, for well-being, for climate change? And with a cohort of 3,600 social entrepreneurs and many, many more change makers, we have the ability to spot and see patterns in terms of the history of the emergence of ideas. I like to think of our search process for these people as something similar to what an epidemiologist does, but instead of looking for disease incidents, we're finding solution sets and making them visible.
Thank you so much for talking to us tonight. One question related to what you just said about climate change. I'm always wondering, what are sort of the limits you see, given your experience? What are the limits of bottom-up approaches? How much of social change can only come from top-down approaches, and how much of the system needs to be changed that cannot be done through community-level work?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, our social entrepreneurs are trying to tackle the systems. They're coming through our process as social entrepreneurs because we see the potential for transforming systems. So, you know, an effort that started to change the way young people, to change curriculum in public schools and in India, for instance, where started in one school in Mumbai, but it rapidly moved beyond, became a policy within the municipal system in Mumbai to make sure that the subject matter was no longer about the London Bridge and ravens, but in fact, flora and fauna of India. So that became a education system in Mumbai change that then spread to other states, other cities and states in India. So changing a fundamental change in the education system in India. I gave the example of Jaru Bilmoria's phone line. The phone line didn't change policy, but the data that she collected as part of the phone line informed the child welfare plan for the entire country when she became an advisor. So another example from India, and I'm sorry, I'm thinking of one person and then I'm thinking of the next person, but Javed Abidi was working in the field of disability on a community effort and made it his business to make sure that the disabled were counted in the Indian census, which had never been the case. How do you make social policy for an invisible population? It's impossible. But his efforts, which started at a community level, led to, again, people being able to see a problem that previously was invisible. So while the start is not necessarily systemic or structural, it has the potential. And we're finding people, as they're beginning to see the structure and system change. But they've been working for decades before that, frequently, learning.
Please, one last question.
Hello. Okay. So based on your experiences and also your experiences in working with different entities at different countries, and also about your idea about scaling up, your original idea of being social entrepreneurial, do you think that it's counterintuitive to, do you think that social entrepreneurship is a grassroots movement or it's something that you should work with the government, and the government and also a lot of those entities are very bureaucratic? And do you think that's like a counterintuitive idea because you are trying to like decentralize what's going on in the system, but at the same time you're trying to work your way up to change the whole system? Thank you.
I love the question. Yes, it at sometimes. So in terms of the idea of focused and grassroots, the ideas need to come from somewhere. And having an entity like Ashoka, and there are many more now, that are looking for these ideas, enables capital, financial, human, other support to support these ideas. The central insight is the solutions need to come from the individuals who are experiencing the reality. That was the core shift. It wasn't that experts from some other continent are going to fly in and solve all the problems. How do you flip that system so that the ideas, because they of course exist, but aren't getting the visibility or the awareness? So there needs to be a match, or the ideas need to surface. And what we've seen as we've tracked some of the data is that we were surprised when we started seeing this. Over half of our social entrepreneurs are having national policy change within 5 years. Yes, we're looking for people who are going to have system change ideas, but we weren't hearing anybody saying, I'm going to go lobby, or I'm going to go write new law. And it's often not the social entrepreneurs who are writing the law or the lobby. That's where the change makers come in. That's where allies and team members that individual social entrepreneurs have met along the way and brought into their movement. So, there is a team and a community that may not be within the organization, but when an idea is good enough, it gets traction. So, and we're seeing government, it's been fascinating to watch. This is one of the privileges of staying in a role, to see the course of history emerge or change and evolve, where, government has become an ally in some places. And we started to have a conversation. The White House Office of Social Innovation was created under President Obama. The EU set up a major fund for social entrepreneurship. I get an email from our lead in Cairo that she has just had a conversation with the ministry in Egypt post-Arab Spring about doing something around social innovation in Egypt. This is an evolving landscape. It's global. Government can and must play a role. The Social Innovation Fund also was started under President Obama's administration, where, again, many funders came together to create a fund for good ideas to scale. So government can and is an ally. We're also seeing that in some places the largest flow of capital to scale ideas is coming from government backing, or taking aspects of ideas that are coming out of social entrepreneurs. And yeah, time will tell.
Thank you very much.